To my YouTube channel, Nady the Coder. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about constructors and the new operator. In the previous lectures, we talked about objects and all the different methods and how we can manipulate objects and all that. Before diving into this lecture, please make sure that you watch the previous videos of the JavaScript tutorial in order to follow along. Let's just dive into the lecture. In the regular object literal syntax allows us to create one object. Sometimes we need to create many similar objects like multiple users or many items and so on. And that can be done using constructor functions with the new operator. And we cannot do that with the object literal. So if you want to create an object, with the object literal, you can just create one object. If you want to replicate with some more parameters and some more data, you cannot make it dynamic. So in that case, you need to make use of constructor functions over here. So let's talk about constructor functions. Basically, constructor functions technically are regular functions. They are named with the capital letter first. So the first letter of the constructor function will always be a capital letter. And that should be executed only with a new operator. So that's how we recognize that basically we are calling a constructor function or normal function. Let's look into an example and see how it looks. So for example, we have a function over here, and as we know, the convention over here that we need to make the first letter of the function, of the constructor function, capital, and then followed by the small. And we can pass any parameter that we want. For now, we can pass, for example, name, and then we can create the body of the function like this. In order to call this function, we can create a variable. We can call it anything. And then we have to make use of the new operator or the new keyword and then call the function or the constructor function itself. And we need to pass the parameter. For now, let's say it's Jackson. When a function is executed with the new keyword, it does the following steps. A new empty object is created and assigned to this, basically this keyword. The function body executes usually. It modifies this object. And basically most of the time we add new properties to this object, and the value of this is then returned. So let's say we have this user constructor function. Behind the scenes, when we declare this user constructor function, this is what happens in the first step. It creates an empty object and assign it to this. So basically this is what happens. We don't need to do this explicitly. This is done by default. And for example, we add some properties to this, for example, name, and we can assign it the name value that is passed from here. And for example, we have another property that is called as admin, and we assign it false value for now. And then behind the scenes, it returns this object. This is basically the keyword object I'm referring to. So it returns this object by default. We don't need to explicitly define the return statement and the constructor function. So let's say we want to print this name or the other value. We can simply do a console over here. We can simply do user dot. You can see the list of the properties that I have access to. For now, I'll do the name and I'll save it. Refresh the page. You can see Jackson. So this is how it works behind the scenes. Now, if you want to create other users, for example, in this case, I just created one user that's called Jackson, and I want to use the same object or the constructor function and create different users like Anna or Alice. I simply have to copy this and paste it. And let's say I call this 1, call it this user 2 and user 3. And I can pass different parameters to this like Anna, Alice, and in order to print the values, I can simply copy and paste and user1.name, user2.name, and user3.name. And I'll have access to all these objects that's been created from this one constructor function. And I'll refresh. You can see I have 3 values that's called Jackson, Anna, and Alice. So basically you can see this is much shorter than using literals every time and also easy to read. That's basically the main purpose of constructors, to implement reusable object creation code. Let's note once again that technically any function except arrow functions, as they don't have this keyword that we learned in the previous lectures, can be used as a constructor. it can be run with the new keyword and it will execute the algorithm that we discussed. The capital letter first is basically a common agreement to make it clear that a function is to be run with the new keyword. Now checking the constructor mode. As we've seen that constructor functions are basically normal functions, but they have two distinctions. The first one is that we are using the capital letter in the name of the function, and then we have to make use of the new keyword. But we can also call the function without the new keyword. So inside a function, we can check whether it was called with the new keyword or without it, and then making use of a special property that's called new.target. So this property will be undefined for regular calls and equals the function if called with the new keyword. So let's say we have this constructor function, and let's say it's called without the new keyword. And I'll just get rid of all of these new keywords. We can also take a look over here. We can say f new.target. This is basically the special property that I was talking about. So it means whether this function is called with the new keyword or not. So we can simply print with new keyword. Otherwise, we can simply say called without new keyword. When I refresh the page, you can see that it's called without the new keyword. We're getting that first if condition true, and we're getting this console message. And you can also see that we are getting an error cannot read properties of undefined. So the name is basically undefined for this one. In order to fix this error, we can simply do, instead of this, we can do something like this: return new user and pass it the name, whatever name we are passing. And when we save the file and refresh, you can see called with the new keyword now. You can see Jackson, Anna, and Alice. So this approach is sometimes used in libraries to make the syntax more flexible so that people may call the function with or without the new keyword and it still works. But probably it's not a good thing to use everywhere though, because omitting the new keyword makes it a bit less obvious what's going on. And with new keyword, we all know that, okay, this new object is being created and it's basically a constructor functions. Let's talk about return statement from a constructor or return from constructors. So usually constructors do not have a return statement. As we've seen, their task is to write all necessary stuff into this, basically this object, and automatically becomes a result. So it by default return that this object, so you don't have to explicitly define or return anything from the function itself. But what if there is a return statement in the constructor function itself? Well, then the rule is simple. If return is called with an object, then the object is returned instead of this. But if a return is called with a primitive value, then it is ignored. In simple words, we can say that return with an object returns that object, and in all other cases, this is returned. So let's just see this in a practical example. So let's say we are returning something like hello world, and we save this file. What happens now over here? So when I console log this user 1 and I save it and I refresh, you can see I'm getting hello world. Let's just get rid of the console log message over here, and I'll do something like this, not new.target. Then it will do this. Get rid of this extra. When I refresh, you can see hello world. So since I'm returning an object from the constructor functions, then it returns the object itself. But if I try to return something, for example, a primitive value, let's say we return a true or false value, for example, if I return a number from here, then what happens here? You can see that the primitive values is ignored, and now we're getting the the object that is basically the this object from the constructor function. So usually constructors don't have a return statement, and here we mentioned the special behavior with returning objects mainly for the sake of completeness. Now what happens if we omit the parentheses? So we can also omit the parentheses after the new keyword if it has no arguments. So let's say we have this object and it's not accepting any arguments or any parameters. Then we can just get rid of this, and we can simply, for example, name it anything that we want. And since it's not accepting any arguments, then we can just get rid of the parentheses and we don't need to pass any parameters to this. We can simply make use of this and it will work as expected. Now I refresh the page. You can still see this object is returned from the constructor function. So yeah, it would work without the parentheses, or calling the constructor functions will also work without the parentheses. But omitting the parentheses here is not considered a good start as well, but the syntax is permitted by specification. Now let's talk about methods in constructor. So using the constructor functions to create objects gives us a great deal of flexibility. The constructor function may have parameters that define how to construct the object and what to put inside it. But of course we can add to this not only properties, not only primitives and objects, but methods as well. For instance, let's say that our user constructor function has a method that is called, say, hi, and we can just assign it a function using the function expression, and we can just console log a message, and we can say hello, this dot name, and in order to call it, I can simply do user1 dot hi. I can get rid of this. I'll set the file, refresh, and you can see hello Jackson. So this is how we can add methods to the constructor function. To create complex objects, there is more advanced syntax, and that's called classes, and we'll cover that in the later videos. But for now, we'll just stick to the objects and the constructor function and all that. So this is the end of the lecture, and I hope you have learned something new in this video. Please like and share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to press the bell icon for future updates. And until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.